She's not picking up. Again. The aide's voice carried a note of disbelief that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. In the West Wing, where loyalty was measured in answered calls and returned texts, Marjorie Taylor Greene had always been first to respond, sometimes before the phone even finished its first ring. She'd built her reputation on it, this almost supernatural availability, this willingness to drop everything when the president needed a defender on cable news or a vote on the House floor. Now the call log showed 4 attempts in 3 days, each one rolling to voicemail, each silence louder than the last. The president set down his phone and stared at the wall where a photograph used to hang. The two of them at a rally in Georgia, her face radiant with the particular joy of a true believer, standing next to her prophet. Someone had removed it yesterday, on his orders. He didn't want to look at traitors while he worked. 300 miles south, in a congressional office that still smelled faintly of the flowers her staff had bought to celebrate her last re-election, Greene watched the same calls come in and let them die. Each vibration felt like a test she was finally refusing to take. How many times had she rearranged her life around that ringtone? How many family dinners interrupted? How many moments with her children cut short? How many nights spent defending him on television when she should have been sleeping? The loyalty had never been transactional for her. That was what the critics never understood. She hadn't supported him for power or position, or the rush of proximity to fame. She'd believed that he meant what he said about draining the swamp, about putting America first, about fighting for the forgotten people in places like her district, where factories had closed and hope had calcified into resentment. And now he was calling her a traitor for asking a simple question: why won't you release the files? The question that had ended everything wasn't supposed to be controversial. Jeffrey Epstein's connections had haunted American politics for years, a wound that festered in the public imagination, fueling conspiracy theories and corrosive distrust. Both parties had members who'd been photographed with him, flown on his plane, accepted his donations. The demand for transparency should have been bipartisan, obvious, the kind of easy win that politicians loved, appear tough on predators, give the people what they wanted, move on. But when Greene and a handful of other Republicans began pushing for the files' release, something shifted. The president who'd once promised to expose every secret suddenly went quiet, then defensive, then hostile. He called the push a Democrat hoax, called Republicans who supported it stupid, called Greene herself, something she never thought she'd hear from his lips, a traitor. The word had detonated through conservative media like a bomb dropped on friendly territory. For 5 years, Marjorie Taylor Greene had been the movement's most visible warrior, the congresswoman who'd been stripped of committee assignments for her rhetoric and worn the punishment like a medal, the firebrand who'd proposed impeaching Biden on his first day in office, the provocateur who'd turned every controversy into fuel for the populist fire. She'd been mocked, vilified, threatened, investigated. None of it had touched her. She'd drawn strength from the hatred of her enemies, from the knowledge that every attack proved she was over the target. But this was different. This came from inside the house, from the man she'd defended when everyone else had abandoned him, from the movement she'd helped build with her own voice and body and reputation. Traitor. The word echoed through her skull at 3 a.m, when sleep wouldn't come, and the ceiling above her bed seemed to press down like a judgment. Her children had started receiving messages. That was the part that broke something inside her, the part she couldn't rationalize or combat or spin into another battle. Her daughters, her son, adults now, living their own lives, had become targets because their mother had asked a question. The messages weren't policy critiques or political disagreements. They were threats, explicit and vicious, promising violence in language that made her stomach turn. She spent years cultivating controversy, understanding intuitively that outrage was currency in the attention economy, that the more people screamed about her, the more powerful she became. She never imagined the screaming would come from her own side, directed at her own family, punishment for the sin of insufficient loyalty. The week before her resignation, she'd sat in a diner in Dalton, Georgia, trying to remember what normal felt like. A woman approached her table, 60-something, weathered hands, the kind of face you saw in church pews and grocery store lines across her district. Greene braced for the confrontation, the accusation, the demand to know why she'd betrayed the president. Instead, the woman leaned in close and whispered, "Don't let them break you. Some of us see what's happening." It was such a small moment, so easily dismissed, but Greene found herself replaying it for days afterward. Some of us see what's happening. What was happening? A president turning on his allies for asking uncomfortable questions. A party that demanded absolute loyalty while delivering nothing on the promises that had put them in power. Healthcare premiums doubling while leadership focused on foreign policy. families in her district struggling to afford insulin while billions flowed to overseas conflicts. She'd run for Congress to fight for those families. Somewhere along the way, the fight had become about something else entirely. The decision to resign crystallized slowly, then all at once. She had considered fighting primary against whoever the president endorsed, turning the race into a referendum on what MAGA actually meant. The polls in her district suggested she could win. Her constituents had elected her 3 times. They knew who she was, knew she'd never stop fighting for them, even when her own party tried to silence her. But the cost was becoming unbearable. Not the political costs, she'd never minded that, the personal costs. The threats to her children, the isolation from colleagues who'd once called her a friend, the exhaustion of defending herself against attacks from people who should have been allies. She thought about her father, gone now, who'd taught her that courage meant knowing when to stand and when to walk away. Walking away wasn't surrender. Sometimes it was the bravest thing you could do. She recorded the video on a Friday evening after the House had emptied and the Capitol had taken on that particular silence of a building holding its breath. 11 minutes, no teleprompter, no staff hovering to suggest softer language or strategic omissions. She looked into the camera and said what she'd been thinking for months, that the Republican Party had lost its way, that the president had abandoned the agenda that had put him in office, that leadership was more interested in punishing dissent than solving problems. She predicted they'd lose the midterms, a statement that would have been unthinkable from her a year ago when she'd been the party's most enthusiastic cheerleader. Now it felt like prophecy, the kind of truth that gets you exiled precisely because everyone knows it's true. The reaction was immediate and predictable. The president posted within hours calling her resignation great news for the country, claiming she'd quit rather than face a primary she couldn't win. His allies piled on, each one eager to demonstrate their loyalty by savaging the woman who'd once been the most loyal of all. But something else happened too, something quieter and harder to measure. In her district, people started showing up at her local office, not to protest, but to thank her. They brought flowers, cards, plates of food their grandmothers would have recognized. They told her she'd said what they'd been feeling, that they were tired of being told to hate their neighbors, tired of promises that never materialized into policy, tired of a politics that seemed designed to generate outrage rather than results. You didn't leave us, one man told her, his voice cracking. They left us. You just finally said it out loud. The fracturing had been building for months, invisible to anyone not paying close attention. The MAGA coalition that had delivered victory in 2024 was always more fragile than it appeared, a collection of grievances and hopes held together by the president's personality and the shared enemy of the establishment. But coalitions built on opposition struggle when they have to govern. The base wanted border security. They got a focus on foreign wars. They wanted health care they could afford. They got premium increases that threatened to bankrupt middle-class families. They wanted the swamp drained. They got the same donor class and consultant ecosystem repackaged with populist branding. Green had been one of the few voices pointing out these contradictions, and for that sin she'd been excommunicated. Speaker Mike Johnson faced an impossible calculus. The House majority had been razor thin to begin with, 219 Republicans to 213 Democrats, and every resignation tightened the margin further. Green's departure would create a special election in a district that was reliably red but not guaranteed, especially with the party's brand suffering and the president's approval numbers sliding. Johnson had never been close to Green. She tried to remove him from the speakership just last year, part of a pattern of insurgency that made her both valuable and exhausting. But he understood, perhaps better than the president did, that her exit represented something larger than one troublesome congresswoman going home. It represented a crack in the foundation, a warning that the coalition was straining under pressures it might not survive. The healthcare issue had been the match, but the kindling had been accumulating for months. Across the country, families who'd voted for the president were opening their insurance portals to find premiums that had doubled or tripled, the result of enhanced subsidies expiring without congressional action. Green had been one of the loudest voices demanding that leadership address the crisis, breaking with her party to side with Democrats on extending the tax credits. It was this, even more than the Epstein files, that had triggered the president's fury. Healthcare was supposed to be a Democratic issue, a vulnerability to exploit rather than a problem to solve. By treating it as urgent, by insisting that real people were suffering while Washington played political games, Green had violated an unwritten rule: never make your own side look bad, even when your own side is failing. In her resignation video, she'd addressed this directly. Americans are used by the political industrial complex of both political parties, she said, her voice steady but tight with emotion, election cycle after election cycle, in order to elect whichever side can convince Americans to hate the other side more. And the results are always the same, no matter which way the political pendulum swings. It was a remarkable statement from a woman who'd built her career on partisan combat, who'd once seemed to embody the politics of hatred she was now condemning. Critics called it hypocrisy, supporters called it growth. The truth, as always, was probably somewhere in between, a person confronting the consequences of a system she'd helped create, wondering if redemption was possible or even desirable. The president's inner circle was divided on how to handle the fallout. Some argued for magnanimity, thank her for her service, wish her well, move on. Others wanted blood, a public destruction, so complete it would deter anyone else from stepping out of line. The second faction won, as it usually did. Within hours of her announcement, opposition research was being compiled, surrogates were being briefed, the machinery of political annihilation was grinding into motion. They'd done this before, to Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, and Jeff Flake, and every other Republican who dared to criticize the president. The playbook was familiar: question their motives, attack their character, make the cost of dissent so high that no one would risk it. Greene knew this was coming. She'd helped write the playbook. But something felt different this time. Greene wasn't a moderate squish who'd never really been MAGA to begin with. She was the movement's ID, its most unfiltered voice, the congresswoman who'd said out loud what others only thought destroying her wouldn't be as simple as painting her as a secret liberal or an establishment plant. The base knew her. They'd watched her fight for years. Some of them were starting to wonder if maybe she had a point, if maybe the party had changed, if maybe the promises were never going to be kept, if maybe they'd been used. The whispers in diners and church parking lots and Facebook groups weren't loud enough to show up in polls yet, but they were there, spreading like cracks in ice that looked solid until suddenly it wasn't. Her final weeks in office passed in a strange twilight. She still showed up for votes, still met with constituents, still did the job she'd been elected to do, but there was a freedom now, a lightness that came from having nothing left to lose. She said things she'd been thinking for months, about the party's abandonment of working families, about the hollow rhetoric that substituted for policy, about the cultish demand for loyalty to a person rather than to principles. Some colleagues avoided her in the hallways, afraid of contamination. Others sought her out privately, confessing doubts they'd never voiced publicly, asking if she thought there was any way back to what the movement had once promised to be. She didn't have answers for them. She barely had answers for herself. The Georgia Republican Party issued a statement calling her a tireless fighter whose legacy as a bold voice for the grassroots will endure. It was kind of boilerplate praise that politicians deploy when they're not sure what else to say, generic enough to offend no one while committing to nothing. Greene read it and laughed, a bitter sound that surprised her. 5 years ago, she'd have parsed every word for hidden meanings, strategized about how to leverage the statement for maximum advantage. Now it just seemed tired, the empty language of a system that had forgotten how to speak honestly about anything. Her last day would be January 5th, 2 days after the new Congress was sworn in. She'd chosen the date deliberately, early enough to trigger a special election, late enough to give her district representation through the transition. Some speculated she was positioning for a future run, keeping her options open for a Senate race or even something bigger. She denied it, and for once the denial seemed genuine. "I'm going back to the people I love," she'd said in her video, "to live life to the fullest as I always have." It sounded like something a person said when they were genuinely finished, when the fire that had driven them into public life had finally burned down to embers. The morning after her announcement, she drove through her district one more time, past the carpet mills and chicken plants, past the churches and dollar stores, past the homes where people were waking up to lives that politics had failed to improve. She thought about the woman in the diner, the one who told her not to let them break her. She thought about her children, who could maybe stop looking over their shoulders now. She thought about the version of herself who'd first run for Congress, full of conviction and fury and the absolute certainty that she was fighting for something worth fighting for. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she'd known once and lost touch with, someone she might or might not want to become again. The Republican Party would survive her departure, as it survived other defections and scandals and internal wars. The president would find new allies, new villains, new dramas to dominate the news cycle. The midterms would come and go, and someone would win and someone would lose, and the machinery would grind on toward the next election and the one after that. But something had shifted, something that couldn't be unshifted. The true believer had stopped believing, and she'd said so out loud, and now the question hung in the air for anyone willing to hear it. What happens when the people who built the movement start to wonder if the movement was ever real? Marjorie Taylor Greene pulled into her driveway as the sun was setting, painting the Georgia sky in shades of orange and red. Her phone buzzed, another call from Washington, another demand for her attention, another chance to be pulled back into the war. She looked at the screen for a long moment, then turned off the phone and walked inside. The door closed behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence, final and somehow freeing. Whatever came next, it would be hers to choose. For the first time in 5 years, that felt like enough.